In the twilight hours of ancient Greece, when the Mediterranean wind whispered through olive groves and the last light of day painted marble columns in hues of gold and amber, storytellers would gather their listeners close. The gentle rhythm of waves against rocky shores provided nature's own lullaby as tales older than written memory began to unfold. These were not mere stories, but the sacred threads from which an entire civilization wove its understanding of existence, love, loss, and the eternal dance between mortals and the divine. Long before the great city-states rose from the Greek peninsula, before the Parthenon crowned the Athenian Acropolis, the seeds of these mythological tales were already taking root in the collective consciousness of scattered tribes and early settlements. The geography itself seemed to invite such stories, a land of countless islands scattered like jewels across azure seas, mountains that reached toward the heavens, and caves that descended into mysterious depths. Each natural feature would become a stage for divine drama, each season a chapter in the eternal story of gods and mortals. As you settle into this ancient narrative, let the gentle cadence of these timeless tales carry you toward peaceful rest. The story begins not with a single moment, but with the vast emptiness that preceded all existence, a void so complete that even the concept of nothingness had not yet been born. From this primordial emptiness emerged chaos, not as destruction, but as the first stirring of potential. Chaos was neither male nor female, neither light nor dark, but the raw essence from which all things would eventually spring. In this swirling, formless realm, the first powers began to differentiate themselves from the endless grey. Gaia, the earth herself, arose as the first solid foundation, her body becoming the mountains, valleys, and plains that would support all future life. She was followed by Tartarus, the deep places beneath the earth where light had never touched, and Eros, the force of attraction and creation that would drive all future generation. As the night deepens around you, imagine these first moments of creation unfolding in slow, dreamlike movements. Gaia, alone in her vastness, felt the stirring of creative power within her earthen form. Without the need for a partner, she brought forth Uranus, the starry sky, who stretched himself across her surface like a vast, loving embrace. Their union created the first divine children, beings of such power and strangeness that they would shape the very foundations of reality. The Titans emerged first, 12 mighty beings who embodied the raw forces of nature and time. Oceanus became the great river that encircled the world, his waters providing the boundary between the known and unknown. Coeus represented the axis of the heavens around which all celestial bodies would turn. Creus embodied the constellation of the Ram, while Hyperion became the force that drove the sun across the sky. Iapetus, whose name would echo through generations, became the ancestor of humanity itself. Cronus, youngest and most cunning of the males, would play a crucial role in the dramas to come. Among the female Titans, Thea shone with the light of precious metals and gems. Rhea embodied the flowing of time and the natural rhythms of life and death. Themis became the personification of divine law and proper custom. Phoebe glowed with the silver light of prophecy and the moon. Mnemosyne held within her divine mind the power of memory itself, ensuring that nothing important would ever be truly lost. Tethys joined with her brother Oceanus to rule over the waters that nourished all life. But Uranus and Gaia's creative power produced children more strange and terrible than the Titans. The Cyclopes came next, beings with but one enormous eye in the center of their foreheads, yet possessed of incredible skill in crafting and building. Their names, Brontes, Steropes, and Arges, spoke of thunder, lightning, and the bright flash of the thunderbolt. Even more fearsome were the 100-handed ones, the Hecatonchires, each possessed of 50 heads and 100 mighty arms. Cottus, Briareus, and Gyges were beings of such overwhelming power that even their divine father feared what they might become. As you drift deeper into this ancient dreamscape, the family drama of the earliest gods begins to unfold with the tragic inevitability of a great, slow-moving river. Uranus, looking upon his youngest children, felt not pride, but terror. The Cyclopes and Hecatoncheires were too powerful, too strange, too threatening to his rule over the cosmos. In his fear, he thrust them back into the depths of their mother's body, imprisoning them in the dark places beneath the earth. Gaia's pain at this cruel treatment of her children was beyond mortal understanding, a grief that shook the foundations of the world itself. In her anguish, Gaia conceived a plan for revenge against her sky husband. She created from her own substance a great sickle of adamant, a metal harder than diamond, sharper than obsidian. Gathering her Titan children around her, she revealed the weapon and spoke of her plan. Only Cronus, the youngest, possessed the courage and cunning necessary for such a deed. As Uranus descended to embrace Gaia in their nightly union, Cronus struck with the divine sickle, severing his father's divine essence and casting it far across the earth and sea. From the drops of Uranus's divine blood that fell upon Gaia's surface sprang new beings, the Erinyes, or Furies, whose purpose would be to pursue and punish those who committed crimes against family and natural law. The Melian nymphs emerged to inhabit the ash trees, while the giants, beings of enormous strength and wild nature, rose from the earth itself. Where the severed essence fell into the sea foam, something beautiful and terrible began to form. Aphrodite, goddess of love and desire, would rise from these waters fully formed, bringing both ecstasy and suffering to gods and mortals alike. With Uranus defeated and withdrawn to the distant reaches of the sky, Cronus assumed rulership over the cosmos. He freed his Titan siblings from the places of their exile, and together they established the Golden Age, a time when the world knew peace and abundance. Yet Cronus did not free the Cyclopes or the Hecatoncheires, keeping them imprisoned in Tartarus, perhaps fearing that they too might one day rise against him as he had risen against his father. The Titans took dominion over different aspects of the world, and as the peaceful night continues, their realm seems like a dream of perfect order. Oceanus and Tethys ruled the waters, bringing gentle rains and flowing streams. Hyperion and Thea governed the movements of sun and moon, ensuring that day and night followed their proper courses. Coeus and Phoebe brought wisdom and prophecy, while Crius and Eurybia managed the seasonal winds and the power of the storm. Cronus himself took as his wife his sister Rhea, and she began to bear him children who would be the next generation of divine beings. But a prophecy hung over Cronus like a gathering storm cloud. He had been warned that one of his children would overthrow him just as he had overthrown his own father. The fear that had driven Uranus to imprison his youngest children now infected Cronus with an even more terrible madness. As each child was born to Rhea, Cronus would seize the infant and swallow it whole, consuming his own progeny to prevent the fulfillment of the prophecy. One by one, the divine children disappeared into their father's maw. Hestia, who would have been goddess of the hearth and home, was first to suffer this fate. Demeter, destined to bring the gift of agriculture to humanity, followed. Hera, future queen of the gods, was third to be consumed. Hades, lord of the underworld, was fourth, and Poseidon, master of the seas, was fifth. Each time, Rhea's grief grew deeper, until it seemed that her sorrow might tear the very fabric of reality. As you rest in the gentle embrace of sleep, imagine Rhea's desperate plan taking shape. When she felt the stirring of her sixth child within her womb, she travelled to the island of Crete, to a hidden cave on Mount Ida, where the child could be born in secret. This child she named Zeus, and immediately after his birth, she wrapped a great stone in swaddling clothes and returned to Cronus. The hungry king of the Titans devoured the false infant without hesitation, believing he had once again prevented his doom. Meanwhile, on Crete, the infant Zeus was raised in secret by the nymphs of the mountain, fed on the milk of the goat Amalthea and the honey of sacred bees. The Curetes, warrior priests of the island, danced wild dances and clashed their shields whenever the divine baby cried, ensuring that his father would never hear him. As Zeus grew, so did his power and his knowledge of his true heritage. The time would come when he would emerge from hiding to claim his birthright and free his siblings from their terrible prison. That day arrived when Zeus had grown to full divine maturity. Returning to his father's palace, he disguised himself as a cupbearer and served Cronus a special drink prepared with the help of Metis, a daughter of Oceanus renowned for her wisdom and cunning. The potion caused Cronus to violently disgorge all the children he had swallowed, beginning with the stone that had been wrapped as a baby and ending with Hestia, who had been first consumed. Each of Zeus's siblings emerged fully grown and divine, ready to take their place in the cosmic order. The release of the swallowed gods marked the beginning of the great conflict known as the Titanomachy, the war between the Titans and the Olympians that would rage for 10 long years. The very foundations of the cosmos shook as divine forces clashed in battles that mortal minds could barely comprehend. Mountains were hurled like stones, seas boiled, and the sky itself seemed ready to crack under the pressure of such titanic combat. Zeus and his siblings established their stronghold on Mount Olympus, the highest peak in Greece, which rose so far into the heavens that its summit was lost in eternal clouds. From this divine fortress, they waged their war against Cronus and the other Titans, who had made their bastion on Mount Othrys. The conflict might have continued forever, with neither side able to gain decisive advantage, had Zeus not remembered the imprisoned Cyclopes and Hecatoncheires. Descending into the depths of Tartarus, Zeus freed these ancient beings from their long captivity. In gratitude, the Cyclopes forged for him the weapons that would ensure his victory, the thunderbolt that could shatter mountains, the aegis that could turn any attacker's heart to ice with fear, and the helmet of invisibility. For Poseidon, they crafted the great trident that could split the earth and command the seas. For Hades, they made the helmet of invisibility that would allow him to move unseen through any realm. As the night deepens and your breathing grows slower and more peaceful, the final battle of the Titanomachy unfolds like a cosmic storm. The Hecatoncheires, with their 100 hands each hurling massive boulders, created a rain of stone that darkened the sky. Zeus wielded his thunderbolts with devastating effect, each strike illuminating the battlefield with divine fire. The very atoms of existence seemed to scream as forces beyond mortal comprehension clashed in their ultimate fury. When the smoke cleared and the thunder faded to distant rumbles, the Titans had been defeated. Most were bound in chains, forged from the same adamant that had made Cronus's sickle and cast into Tartarus, there to remain until the end of time. The Hecatoncheires became their eternal guards, ensuring that never again would the old powers rise to challenge the new order. A few Titans, like Oceanus and Prometheus, who had remained neutral or aided Zeus in the conflict, were permitted to retain their positions and honor. With victory secured, the three brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, divided the cosmos among themselves by lot. Zeus received dominion over the sky and became king of the gods, ruling from his throne on Mount Olympus. Poseidon took command of all waters, both the seas that surrounded the earth and the rivers and springs that flowed through it. Hades received the underworld, the realm of the dead, and all the precious metals and gems hidden in the earth's depths. The earth itself and Mount Olympus remained common territory, belonging to all the gods equally. The establishment of the Olympian order brought a new stability to the cosmos, but it did not bring immediate peace. Zeus faced challenges from other primordial powers who had not accepted his rule. Gaia, the Earth Mother, grew increasingly frustrated with the new regime and raised up new enemies to test the young king of the gods. The giants, her children born from the blood of Uranus, rose in rebellion under her guidance. These were not the crude, simple giants of later stories, but beings of divine power and cunning, each one a match for an Olympian god in single combat. The Gigantomachy, the war against the giants, required all of Zeus's wisdom and strength. A prophecy declared that the giants could not be defeated by the gods alone. They would need the aid of a mortal hero. Zeus found his champion in Hercules, his son, by the mortal woman Alcmene, whose divine strength and heroic courage would prove crucial in the final battles. As you drift toward deeper sleep, imagine these epic confrontations unfolding across the Greek landscape, each battle reshaping mountains and valleys, creating the geography that would be familiar to classical civilization. The defeat of the giants established Zeus's rule more firmly, but one final challenge remained. Typhoeus, also called Typhon, was perhaps the most terrible monster ever to challenge the Olympian order. Born from the union of Gaia and Tartarus itself, he was a creature of such horrifying aspect that even the gods fled in terror at his approach. His body was humanoid, but scaled like a dragon's. His arms were long enough to span the distance from sunrise to sunset, and from his shoulders sprouted 100 dragon heads, each speaking in a different voice. Sometimes the roar of a lion, sometimes the howl of a wolf, sometimes words in the language of the gods themselves. The battle between Zeus and Typhoeus was a conflict that threatened to undo creation itself. Typhoeus's dragon heads breathed fire that scorched the earth, while Zeus answered with thunderbolts that lit up the entire sky. Mountains melted under the heat of their combat, and the sea boiled where Typhoeus's flames touched its surface. At one point, the monster succeeded in wrapping Zeus in his coils and stealing the sinews from the god's arms and legs, leaving the king of the gods helpless as a newborn child. But Hermes and Aegipan managed to restore Zeus's strength, and the battle resumed with even greater fury. Finally, Zeus succeeded in burying the monster under Mount Etna in Sicily, where Typhoeus remains to this day, his fiery breath emerging from the volcano's peak, his struggles causing the earthquakes that shake the region. With this final victory, Zeus's dominion was secured, and the age of the Olympian gods could truly begin. As the peaceful hours of night continue their gentle passage, the golden age of the Olympian gods unfolds in all its divine splendor. Zeus ruled from his throne on the highest peak of Mount Olympus, where the 12 great gods held their council and governed the affairs of both divine and mortal realms. The palace of the gods was said to be beyond mortal description, built of materials that had no earthly equivalent, its walls glowing with their own inner light, its halls echoing with divine music that could heal any sorrow. Hera, Zeus's wife and queen of the gods, presided over marriage and family life, yet her own marriage was marked by constant strife due to Zeus's numerous affairs with both goddesses and mortal women. Her jealousy was legendary, and many of the great adventures and tragedies of Greek mythology began with Hera's attempts to punish her husband's lovers and their children. Despite this conflict, or perhaps because of it, Hera remained one of the most powerful and respected of the Olympian deities, her authority second only to Zeus himself. Poseidon ruled the seas from his underwater palace, driving across the waves in a chariot pulled by immortal horses, whose hooves could run upon the water's surface as easily as upon dry land. His trident could raise storms or calm them, split open the earth to create new harbours, or cause earthquakes that would topple the mightiest cities. Sailors and fishermen throughout the Mediterranean offered prayers and sacrifices to earn his favor, knowing that their lives depended upon his goodwill. In the realm of the dead, Hades ruled with stern but just authority over the souls of the departed. His kingdom was not a place of torment for most souls, but rather a grey, quiet realm where the dead continued a shadowy existence, drinking from the river Lethe to forget the sorrows of their mortal lives. Beside him sat Persephone, daughter of Demeter, whom he had abducted to be his queen, in a story that would explain the changing of the seasons and the eternal cycle of death and rebirth. The other Olympian gods each governed their own spheres of influence. Athena, born from Zeus's head, fully grown and armoured, became the goddess of wisdom, warfare, and the crafts that required both skill and intelligence. Her city of Athens would become the intellectual centre of the ancient world, its philosophers and artists creating works that would endure for millennia. Apollo, god of music, poetry, prophecy, and healing, drove the chariot of the sun across the sky each day, bringing light and warmth to the world below. His twin sister Artemis ruled over the hunt and the moon, protecting wild animals and young maidens with equal fierce devotion. Aphrodite, born from the sea foam created by Uranus's fall, wielded the power of love and desire that could bring both ecstasy and madness to gods and mortals alike. Her son Eros, armed with bow and arrows, could strike anyone with irresistible passion, often with consequences that would echo through generations. Ares, god of war, represented the brutal, chaotic aspects of battle, while Athena embodied its strategic and defensive elements. The tension between these two approaches to conflict would play out endlessly in both divine and human affairs. Hephaestus, the divine craftsman, worked at his forge beneath Mount Etna, creating wonders of metalwork and engineering that surpassed anything mortals could imagine. Though physically imperfect among the beautiful Olympians, his skills were unmatched, and gods and heroes alike sought his services when they needed weapons or artifacts of supernatural power. His workshops were staffed by golden automatons of his own creation, mechanical beings that could think and act with intelligence rivaling that of living creatures. Demeter governed the fertility of the earth and the growth of crops that sustained mortal life. Her grief during Persephone's annual absence in the underworld caused winter to come to the world, while her joy at her daughter's return brought spring and summer. The Eleusinian mysteries, secret religious rites celebrated in her honor, promised initiates a blessed existence after death and deeper understanding of life's sacred cycles. Hermes, the messenger god, traveled between all realms on his winged sandals, carrying Zeus's commands to other gods and guiding the souls of the dead to Hades' kingdom. His cleverness and wit made him the patron of merchants, thieves, and all who lived by their intelligence rather than their strength. The boundaries between these categories were often unclear, as Hermes himself demonstrated through his numerous adventures and schemes. As you rest in the quiet comfort of night, let your mind drift through the countless stories that emerge from the interactions of these divine personalities. The myths of ancient Greece were not simply religious doctrine, but living stories that grew and changed as they passed from generation to generation, each telling shaped by the needs and understanding of its particular audience. The story of Pandora reveals how the Greeks understood the mixed nature of human existence. When Prometheus stole fire from the gods to give to humanity, Zeus punished this theft by creating the first woman. Each of the Olympian gods contributed to her creation. Hephaestus moulded her from clay. Athena clothed her and taught her handicrafts. Aphrodite gave her beauty and desire, and Hermes provided her with a cunning mind and persuasive speech. Zeus named her Pandora, meaning all-gifted, and sent her to Epimetheus, Prometheus's brother, as a bride. With Pandora came a jar, often mistakenly called a box in later retellings, which she was warned never to open. But curiosity, that most human of traits, overcame her restraint. When the jar was opened, all the evils that plague humanity poured forth: disease, old age, war, famine, and countless forms of suffering. Only hope remained trapped at the bottom, providing the one consolation that would allow humans to endure all other hardships. This tale reflected the Greek understanding that knowledge and progress always came with a price, that the very qualities that elevated humans above other animals, curiosity, ambition, the desire for something better, also brought unique forms of suffering. Yet hope's presence in the jar suggested that even in the darkest circumstances, the possibility of better times ahead could sustain the human spirit. The love affair between Psyche and Eros illustrated another fundamental theme in Greek thought: the relationship between physical beauty and spiritual truth. Psyche, whose name meant soul, was so beautiful that people began to worship her instead of Aphrodite. The jealous goddess commanded her son Eros to make Psyche fall in love with the most hideous creature alive. But when Eros saw her, he fell in love instead and carried her away to a magical palace where he visited her only in darkness, forbidding her to look upon his face. Psyche's sisters, jealous of her mysterious happiness, convinced her that her invisible lover must be a monster who planned to devour her. Armed with a lamp and a knife, Psyche crept up on the sleeping Eros, only to discover that he was the most beautiful of all the gods. A drop of hot oil from her lamp fell on his shoulder, waking him, and he fled in anger at her distrust. Aphrodite then set Psyche a series of seemingly impossible tasks, each designed to destroy her, but with the help of ants, reeds, and eagles. Psyche accomplished them all. The final task required Psyche to descend to the underworld and bring back a box of beauty from Persephone. Warned not to open the box, Psyche nonetheless succumbed to vanity and lifted the lid, only to be overcome by the sleep of the dead. Eros, his love stronger than his anger, awakened her with a kiss, and Zeus, moved by their devotion, granted Psyche immortality so that she could be united with her divine lover forever. As the night deepens and your mind drifts toward peaceful dreams, consider how these stories served multiple purposes in ancient Greek society. They entertained, certainly, but they also provided a framework for understanding the complexities of human emotion and experience. The myth of Psyche and Eros suggested that true love required both passion and trust, that beauty alone was insufficient for lasting happiness, and that the greatest rewards came only after the greatest trials. The tragic story of Orpheus and Eurydice explored the boundaries between love and death, art and reality. Orpheus, son of Apollo, and the muse Calliope possessed a gift for music so profound that wild animals would gather peacefully to listen, trees would uproot themselves to follow his songs, and even stones would weep at the beauty of his melodies. When he married the nymph Eurydice, their happiness seemed as perfect as his music, but on their wedding day, Eurydice stepped on a poisonous snake and died from its bite. Orpheus's grief was so overwhelming that his songs turned to laments that made all of nature mourn with him. Finally, unable to bear his loss, he resolved to descend to the underworld and bring back his beloved. His music opened every door before him, softened every guardian's heart, and finally brought him before the thrones of Hades and Persephone themselves. Even the stern lord of the dead wept at Orpheus's song, and Persephone begged her husband to grant the musician's request. Hades agreed to release Eurydice, but with one condition: Orpheus must not look back at her until they had both emerged into the sunlight. The journey through the shadowy paths of the underworld tested Orpheus's faith to its limits. Behind him, he could hear the soft footsteps that might have been Eurydice following, or might have been echoes of his own movement. As they approached the entrance to the world of the living, doubt crept into Orpheus's heart. Unable to resist, he turned to look and saw Eurydice fading back into the shadows, reaching toward him with love and forgiveness, even as she returned to death forever. This myth resonated deeply with the Greek understanding of the artist's relationship to both beauty and loss. Orpheus's music had the power to move heaven and earth, but it could not ultimately conquer death. His very love, expressed through his art, became the source of his greatest tragedy. The story suggested that the most profound artistic expression often emerges from the deepest personal pain, and that the attempt to reclaim what has been lost, while noble, may be doomed by the very human weaknesses that make such art possible. The hero Perseus provides a different model of mythological narrative, one focused on adventure and the triumph of courage over seemingly impossible odds. Born to Danae after Zeus visited her in the form of a golden shower, Perseus grew up unaware of his divine heritage. When the oracle prophesied that Danae's son would kill his grandfather, King Aphrodite locked mother and child in a bronze chamber and cast them into the sea. They washed ashore on the island of Seriphos, where they were taken in by the fisherman Dictys. Years later, when Perseus had grown to manhood, the island's king Polydectes fell in love with Danae and sought to remove her son from his path. Announcing his intention to marry another woman, Polydectes demanded wedding gifts from all his subjects. Perseus, having no wealth to offer, rashly promised to bring the king anything he desired. Polydectes immediately demanded the head of the Gorgon Medusa, whose gaze could turn any living creature to stone. This seemed like a death sentence, but Perseus's divine parentage brought him divine aid. Athena provided him with a polished bronze shield that would allow him to see Medusa's reflection without meeting her deadly gaze directly. Hermes gave him winged sandals for swift travel and an adamantine sword sharp enough to cut through the Gorgon's bronze scales. The nymphs of the north provided him with Hades' helmet of invisibility and a magic bag that would safely contain Medusa's head once it was severed. The quest itself required not just courage but cunning. Perseus had to locate the Grey Sisters, ancient crones who shared a single eye and tooth among them, and force them to reveal the location of the Gorgon's lair. He accomplished this by stealing their eye as they passed it between them, refusing to return it until they provided the information he needed. The actual confrontation with Medusa required Perseus to approach her while looking only at her reflection in his shield, strike precisely with his sword, and escape before her immortal sisters could catch him. As you drift deeper into the realm of dreams, imagine Perseus's flight across the Mediterranean. Medusa's head safely contained in his magic bag, its power still so great that drops of her blood falling into the sea gave birth to coral and flying horses. His adventures were far from over, for on his return journey he encountered Andromeda, chained to a rock as a sacrifice to the sea monster Satyrs. Her mother Cassiopeia had boasted that her daughter was more beautiful than the sea nymphs, provoking Poseidon's anger and bringing the monster's attacks upon their kingdom. Perseus's rescue of Andromeda became one of the most beloved stories in all of Greek mythology, combining romantic love with heroic adventure. Using Medusa's head to turn the sea monster to stone, Perseus freed Andromeda and claimed her as his bride. Their wedding was interrupted by her previous suitor Phineus, leading to a battle in which Perseus once again employed the Gorgon's deadly gaze to defeat his enemies. The conclusion of Perseus's story brought the mythological cycle full circle, demonstrating the inexorable working of fate even through heroic action. Returning home to discover that Polydectes had indeed been persecuting his mother, Perseus used Medusa's head to turn the wicked king and his supporters to stone. Later, participating in athletic games, Perseus accidentally killed his grandfather Acrisius with a discus throw, fulfilling the prophecy that had set the entire story in motion. The myth of Theseus offers yet another variation on the heroic pattern, but one more deeply connected to the political and cultural development of Athens. Theseus was claimed by the Athenians as their greatest king and the founder of their democratic institutions, making his stories as much political propaganda as religious narrative. Born to Aethra after her encounter with both Poseidon and King Aegeus of Athens on the same night, Theseus grew up not knowing his father's identity, raised by his mother in the southern city of Trojan. When he reached manhood, Aethra revealed his parentage and showed him the great stone under which Aegeus had left a sword and sandals as tokens for his son. Theseus lifted the stone easily, claiming his inheritance and setting out for Athens to meet his father. Instead of taking the safe sea route, he chose to travel by land, seeking opportunities to prove his heroic worth by defeating the bandits and monsters that plagued the road. Each encounter on Theseus's journey became a separate adventure tale, but together they demonstrated his growing mastery of both physical prowess and moral judgment. He defeated Periphetes the club-bearer, taking the bronze club as his own weapon. He caught Sinis the pine-bender in his own trap. Using the giant's method of execution against him, he killed the monstrous sow of Crommyon and pushed the bandit Siren off the cliff, where Siren had forced travellers to wash his feet before kicking them to their deaths. The most psychologically complex of these encounters was with Procrustes, who offered travellers a bed for the night, then either stretched them or cut off their limbs to make them fit perfectly. Theseus subjected Procrustes to his own treatment, but the deeper meaning of this episode resonated with Greek philosophical thought about the relationship between individual nature and social conformity. The myth suggested that true justice required making the punishment fit not just the crime, but the criminal's own methods and motivations. Arriving in Athens, Theseus found the city under the shadow of a terrible tribute. Years earlier, Aegeus's son Androgeos had been killed while visiting Crete, and King Minos had demanded that Athens send 7 young men and 7 young women every 7 years to feed the Minotaur, a monster with the head of a bull and the body of a man, kept in an inescapable labyrinth beneath Minos's palace. The time for the third tribute had arrived, and despite Aegeus's protests, Theseus insisted on being included among the sacrificial victims. The story of Theseus and the Minotaur became one of the most enduring myths of Greek culture, symbolizing the triumph of Athenian civilization over the older, more barbaric cultures of the Bronze Age. The Minotaur itself was the offspring of Pasiphae, Minos's queen, and a beautiful bull sent by Poseidon, a union that represented the dangerous mixing of human and animal nature, civilization and wildness, order and chaos. As the gentle night continues its peaceful embrace, let your mind follow Theseus into the heart of the labyrinth, that maze so cunningly constructed by the master craftsman Daedalus that no one who entered could ever find their way out again. The corridors twisted and doubled back upon themselves, leading travellers in circles until they died of exhaustion or fell victim to the creature that stalked its passages. But Theseus had gained an unexpected ally in Ariadne, Minos's daughter, who had fallen in love with the young Athenian hero and provided him with a ball of thread to mark his path. The confrontation between Theseus and the Minotaur represented more than just a physical battle. It was a symbolic contest between the emerging rational civilization of classical Greece and the older, more mysterious religious traditions of the Bronze Age Mediterranean. The Minotaur, fed on human sacrifice, embodied everything that the Greeks of the classical period saw as barbaric and primitive in their own past. Theseus's victory, achieved through a combination of courage, intelligence, and divine favor, marked the triumph of the new order. Yet the myth did not end with simple triumph. Theseus's abandonment of Ariadne on the island of Naxos introduced moral complexity into the heroic narrative. Some versions of the story suggested that he forgot her due to divine intervention, others that he callously abandoned her after she had served his purpose. The god Dionysus found and married the deserted princess, elevating her to divine status, but the episode raised questions about the hero's character that would echo through later Greek literature. The tragic conclusion of Theseus's adventure came when his ship approached Athens. He had promised his father to change his sails from black to white if he returned successfully, but in his excitement or forgetfulness, he failed to make the change. Aegeus, watching from a cliff, saw the black sails and threw himself into the sea in grief, giving that body of water its name, the Aegean Sea. Theseus's heroic triumph thus brought personal tragedy, illustrating the Greek belief that great achievements often came at great cost. As king of Athens, Theseus was credited with unifying the scattered communities of Attica under Athenian rule and establishing the democratic institutions that would make Athens famous throughout the ancient world. His later adventures included participation in the hunt for the Caledonian boar, the battle between the Lapiths and Centaurs at Pirithous' wedding, and the expedition of the Argonauts. Each of these stories connected Theseus to the broader network of Greek heroic mythology, while reinforcing his role as Athens' founding father. The tale of Jason and the Argonauts represents perhaps the most complex and sophisticated of all Greek heroic narratives, combining elements of adventure, romance, political intrigue, and divine intervention in a story that spans multiple generations and geographical regions. The quest for the Golden Fleece began with the children of Athamas, king of Orchomenus, whose stepmother Ino sought to destroy them through a plot involving a false famine and corrupted oracle. Phrixus and Helle were saved from sacrifice by a golden ram sent by Hermes. But during their flight across the sea, Helle fell from the ram's back into the waters that would thereafter be called the Hellespont in her memory. Phrixus reached the kingdom of Colchis on the eastern shore of the Black Sea, where King Aeetes welcomed him and gave him his daughter Chalciope in marriage. In gratitude, Phrixus sacrificed the golden ram to Zeus and gave its fleece to Aeetes, who hung it in a sacred grove guarded by a sleepless dragon. Years passed, and in the city of Iolcus in Thessaly, a young man named Jason grew to maturity under the care of the centaur Chiron, wisest of his kind and teacher of heroes. Jason's father Aeson had been the rightful king of Iolcus, but his half-brother Peleus had usurped the throne and driven the royal family into exile. An oracle had warned Peleus to beware of a man with one sandal, and when Jason arrived in the city, having lost one sandal while helping an old woman cross a river, who was actually the goddess Hera in disguise, Peleus immediately recognized the threat. Rather than risk the pollution of killing a kinsman directly, Peleus cunningly proposed that Jason could claim his inheritance if he first proved his worth by recovering the golden fleece from distant Colchis. The task seemed impossible, requiring a journey to the very edge of the known world. But Jason accepted the challenge and began gathering the greatest heroes of his generation for the expedition. The ship Argo, built under Athena's guidance and incorporating timber from the prophetic oak of Dodona, became the vessel for this legendary voyage. The roster of Argonauts read like a catalogue of Greek heroic tradition. Hercules with his incredible strength, Orpheus with his divine music, the Dioscuri Castor and Pollux, the keen-eyed Lynceus, the swift-footed Euphemus, the healer Asclepius, and many others. Each hero brought unique abilities that would prove crucial during the long journey ahead. As you drift deeper into peaceful slumber, imagine the Argo cutting through the wine-dark waters of the Aegean, her crew of heroes facing dangers both natural and supernatural. Their first significant stop was the island of Lemnos, where they discovered a kingdom ruled entirely by women. The Lemnian women had neglected the worship of Aphrodite, and the goddess had cursed them with a foul odour that drove their husbands to seek comfort with Thracian slave women. In their fury, The Lemnian women had killed all the men on the island, but they welcomed the Argonauts, and their leader, Jason, formed a liaison with Queen Hypsipyle that lasted nearly a year. Only Heracles' impatience finally drove the expedition onward, but their trials had only begun. Passing through the Hellespont, they encountered the Doliones, a people locked in eternal warfare with the six-armed giants called the Gygenes. The Argonauts aided their hosts in battle, but when they departed and were blown back to the same shore by contrary winds in the darkness, the Doliones mistook them for enemies and attacked. In the confusion, Jason killed King Cyzicus, their former ally, requiring elaborate funeral rites and purification ceremonies before the voyage could continue. The loss of Heracles marked a turning point in the expedition. When the hero's companion Hylas was abducted by water nymphs who had fallen in love with his beauty, Heracles refused to leave without him, searching frantically through the forests of Mysia. The other Argonauts, pressed by contrary winds and divine commands, were forced to abandon their strongest member and continue without him. This episode illustrated the tension between individual loyalty and collective purpose that would recur throughout the journey. The Argonauts' encounter with the blind prophet Phineus provided both guidance and a demonstration of divine justice. Phineus had been cursed with prophetic knowledge, but also with blindness and the torment of the Harpies, monstrous bird women who would snatch away or defile his food whenever he tried to eat. The winged sons of Boreas, Calais, and Zetes drove off the Harpies in exchange for Phineus's guidance through the Symplegades, the clashing rocks that guarded the entrance to the Black Sea. These massive rocks would crash together whenever anything tried to pass between them, but Phineus advised the Argonauts to send a dove through first and follow immediately behind it. The dove lost only its tail feathers, and the Argo scraped through with the loss of only its stern ornament. According to prophecy, once a ship had successfully navigated the Symplegades, they would remain forever still, opening the Black Sea to future navigation. The approach to Colchis brought the Argonauts face to face with the ultimate challenge of their quest. King Aeetes had no intention of giving up the Golden Fleece willingly, but he could not refuse Jason's request without violating the sacred laws of hospitality. Instead, he proposed a series of tasks that seemed certain to result in the hero's death. Jason would have to yoke 2 fire-breathing bronze bulls, plough a field with them, sow dragons' teeth in the furrows, and then defeat the armed warriors who would spring from the earth. The night grows deeper as divine intervention shapes the course of mortal affairs. Hera and Athena, favouring Jason's cause, persuaded Aphrodite to send her son Eros to strike Medea, Aeetes' daughter and a powerful sorceress, with irresistible love for the young hero. Medea's internal struggle between family loyalty and passionate desire became one of the most psychologically complex episodes in all of Greek mythology, exploring themes that would later be developed in the great tragedies of Euripides and Seneca. Medea's magical knowledge provided Jason with the means to complete the impossible tasks. She gave him an ointment that would protect him from the bull's fiery breath and bronze hooves, and advised him that when the earthborn warriors sprang up, he should throw a stone among them to make them fight each other instead of attacking him. Her aid came at a price. Jason swore by all the gods to marry her and take her back to Greece as his queen. The successful completion of Aeetes' tasks did not, as expected, result in the king honouring his agreement. Instead, he began planning to burn the Argo and kill all the Argonauts during the night. Warned by Medea, Jason and his companions crept to the sacred grove where the golden fleece hung gleaming from an oak tree, guarded by the sleepless dragon. Once again, Medea's magic proved decisive. Her charms and potions lulled the dragon into sleep, allowing Jason to seize the fleece and flee to the ship. The return journey of the Argonauts followed a different route, taking them up the Danube River, across mysterious northern lands, and down the Rhine, creating a geographical impossibility that reflected the mythological rather than historical nature of the tale. Their adventures continued with encounters with the Sirens, whose deadly song was countered by Orpheus's music, and with Scylla and Charybdis, the twin perils that threatened all who sailed through the strait between Italy and Sicily. As your breathing grows slower and more peaceful, the tragic aftermath of the quest begins to unfold. Jason and Medea's marriage, begun under such dramatic circumstances, contained within it the seeds of future catastrophe. Medea's foreignness, her reputation for sorcery, and the circumstances of their first meeting created tensions that would eventually destroy both their love and their lives. When they reached Iolcus, they found that Peleus had killed Jason's father Aeson and taken complete control of the kingdom. Medea's revenge upon Peleus demonstrated the dangerous power of her magical arts. Convincing the usurper's daughters that she could restore their father's youth, she had them cut him into pieces and boil them in a cauldron, but deliberately omitted the herbs that would have completed the resurrection. The horrified daughters fled the city, and Jason and Medea were forced into exile by the revulsion their crime had inspired. They found refuge in Corinth, where for several years they lived in apparent happiness, raising 2 sons, and seeming to have found peace after their tumultuous adventures. But Jason's ambition and the political necessities of his position as an exile led him to abandon Medea for a more advantageous marriage to Glauce, daughter of King Creon of Corinth. This betrayal awakened all of Medea's fury and magical power, leading to a revenge that would shock even a culture accustomed to the violence of heroic legend. Medea's gifts to the new bride, a crown and dress imbued with magical fire, burned Glauce to death along with her father who tried to save her. But Medea's revenge went beyond even this horror. To ensure that Jason would suffer the ultimate loss, she killed their own children, then escaped in a chariot drawn by dragons sent by her grandfather, the sun god Helios. Jason died years later, struck by a falling timber from the rotting Argo as he sat beneath its prow, remembering his days of glory. The story of the Trojan War represents the culmination of Greek heroic mythology, a vast cycle of tales that encompassed multiple generations and provided the foundation for the greatest works of ancient literature. The war's ultimate cause lay in the marriage of Peleus, a mortal hero, to Thetis, a sea nymph whose son was prophesied to be greater than his father. To prevent the birth of a child who might threaten his rule, Zeus arranged for Thetis to marry a mortal, ensuring that her son would be bound by human limitations even while possessing divine strength. The wedding of Peleus and Thetis was attended by all the gods except Eris, the goddess of discord, who was deliberately excluded from the celebration. In her anger, Eris threw among the wedding guests a golden apple inscribed "For the fairest," immediately creating a dispute between Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. Unable to choose between them without making enemies of the other two, Zeus appointed Paris, a prince of Troy who was living as a shepherd on Mount Ida, to judge the contest. Each goddess offered Paris a different bribe for her selection. Hera promised him dominion over all of Asia, Athena offered wisdom and victory in battle, but Aphrodite's gift proved most tempting. She promised him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris awarded the golden apple to Aphrodite, unknowingly setting in motion the events that would destroy his city and bring about the deaths of countless heroes. The most beautiful woman in the world was Helen, daughter of Zeus and Leda, who had grown up in Sparta as the adopted daughter of King Tyndareus. Her beauty was so extraordinary that all the greatest princes of Greece sought her hand in marriage, creating a dangerous situation that threatened to tear the Greek world apart in civil war. Tyndareus solved this problem by requiring all the suitors to swear an oath to support whichever man Helen chose as her husband, and to come to his aid if anyone ever attempted to steal her away. Helen chose Menelaus, brother of the powerful Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, and for several years they lived happily in Sparta. But when Paris came to Sparta as a guest and saw Helen, Aphrodite's promise was fulfilled. Whether Helen went willingly or was abducted against her will became a matter of debate even in ancient times. But the result was the same. She departed for Troy with Paris, taking with her much of Menelaus's treasure, and leaving behind her young daughter, Hermione. As the peaceful night continues its gentle embrace, the gathering of the Greek forces unfolds like a slow-moving but irresistible tide. Menelaus called upon the oath sworn by Helen's former suitors, and one by one, the greatest heroes and kings of Greece answered the summons. Agamemnon was chosen as commander-in-chief of the expedition, bringing with him the wealth and resources of Mycenae. Ajax, son of Telamon, came from Salamis with his tremendous strength and unbreakable shield. The lesser Ajax, son of Oileus, led the Locrians with his speed and skill with the spear. Diomedes brought the warriors of Argos, Idomeneus led the Cretans, and Nestor, despite his advanced age, commanded the men of Pylos with wisdom gained from 3 generations of warfare. Most reluctant was Odysseus, king of the island kingdom of Ithaca, who had recently married Penelope and fathered a son, Telemachus. When the recruiting party arrived at his palace, Odysseus feigned madness by yoking an ox and a horse together and ploughing his fields with salt. But his deception was exposed when Palamedes placed baby Telemachus in front of the plough, forcing Odysseus to swerve aside and reveal his sanity. The most crucial recruitment was that of Achilles, son of Peleus and Thetis, whose participation was essential for Greek victory, according to prophecy. Thetis, knowing that her son was destined to die young if he went to Troy, had hidden him on the island of Scyros, disguised as a girl among the daughters of King Lycomedes. Odysseus discovered him there through a clever ruse, bringing gifts of jewelry and women's clothing, along with weapons and armor. While the real maidens examined the feminine finery, Achilles was immediately drawn to the weapons, revealing his identity and his warrior nature. The Greek fleet assembled at the port of Aulis, but contrary winds prevented their departure for Troy. The prophet Calchas revealed that Artemis was angry because Agamemnon had boasted that he was a better hunter than the goddess herself. To appease her wrath and gain favourable winds, the goddess demanded the sacrifice of Agamemnon's daughter Iphigenia. The king's anguish at this terrible price provided one of the most emotionally powerful episodes in the entire cycle, exploring the conflict between personal love and public duty that would recur throughout the war. Different versions of the myth offered different resolutions to this moral crisis. In some tellings, Iphigenia was actually sacrificed, leaving a wound in Agamemnon's family that would fester until it destroyed him upon his return from Troy. In others, Artemis substituted a deer at the last moment and carried Iphigenia away to serve as her priestess among the Tarians. But in all versions, the terrible choice required of Agamemnon established the war's theme of victory purchased at an unbearable cost. The voyage to Troy and the landing on the Trojan shore brought the first casualties of the war. Protesilaus, the first Greek to leap from his ship onto Trojan soil, was immediately killed by Hector, fulfilling a prophecy that the first to land would be the first to die. His death left his wife Laodamia so grief-stricken that she begged the gods to let her speak with him once more. When Hermes brought Protesilaus' spirit back from the dead for 3 hours, Laodamia killed herself rather than endure a second parting. The initial phase of the war saw the Greeks establishing their beachhead and building their fortified camp, while the Trojans remained safely behind their massive walls. Troy itself was one of the most magnificent cities of the ancient world, built by Poseidon and Apollo, when they served King Laomedon as punishment for their rebellion against Zeus. Its walls were so perfectly constructed that they seemed to grow organically from the rocky hill on which the city stood, and its gates were wide enough for chariots to pass through 4 abreast. King Priam ruled Troy with the wisdom of age and the sorrow of foreknowledge, knowing through prophecy that his city was doomed but unable to prevent the catastrophe. His wife Hecuba had dreamed before Paris's birth that she would give birth to a firebrand that would burn down the city, leading to the infant's exposure on Mount Ida. But the child survived, raised by shepherds, and eventually returned to claim his place in the royal family, bringing with him the doom that could not be avoided. Hector, Priam's eldest son and heir, embodied the ideal of the warrior prince who fought not for personal glory, but for the protection of his family and city. His love for his wife Andromache and their infant son Astyanax provided some of the most touching moments in the entire epic cycle, highlighting the human cost of the heroic ideals that drove the war. Paris, despite being the cause of the conflict, was portrayed as a more complex figure than his reputation might suggest, a man torn between his passion for Helen and his guilt over the suffering he had brought upon his people. As you drift deeper into the realm of peaceful dreams, the long years of the siege unfold in a series of battles, duels, and sieges that gradually wore down both sides. The war was not a continuous conflict, but rather a series of campaigns separated by periods of truce, during which both armies rested, buried their dead, and attempted to find diplomatic solutions to the crisis. These intervals allowed for the development of relationships between enemies that added psychological complexity to the later battles. The catalogue of heroes who fought and died before Troy reads like a roll call of Greek legendary figures. Patroclus, Achilles' beloved companion, whose death would drive the greatest of Greek warriors to his final, fatal fury. Ajax, whose strength and courage were matched only by his pride and his tragic end. Diomedes, who fought so magnificently that he wounded both Ares and Aphrodite when they intervened on the Trojans' behalf. Glaucus and Sarpedon, allies who came from distant Lycia to honour their obligations to Priam. The war's turning point came in its 10th year with the quarrel between Achilles and Agamemnon over the captive maiden Briseis. When Agamemnon was forced to return his own prize, Chryseis, to her father to end a plague sent by Apollo, he compensated himself by taking Briseis from Achilles. The insult to his honour drove Achilles to withdraw from the fighting, taking with him the Myrmidons, his elite warriors, whose absence would be sorely felt in the battles to come. Without Achilles, the Greeks began to suffer serious defeats. Hector led the Trojans in a series of assaults that pushed the invaders back to their ships and threatened to burn the entire fleet. The crisis deepened when Patroclus, unable to bear watching his friends die while Achilles nursed his anger, begged to be allowed to wear Achilles' armour and lead the Myrmidons into battle. Achilles agreed, but warned his companion to do no more than drive the Trojans back from the ships and then return to safety. The sight of Achilles' distinctive armour restored Greek morale and struck fear into Trojan hearts, and for a time, Patroclus carried all before him. But the intoxication of battle and the demands of heroic honour drove him beyond Achilles' instructions. He pursued the fleeing Trojans towards the city walls, killing many enemies including Sarpedon, son of Zeus. There, beneath the walls of Troy, Hector faced him in single combat, and aided by Apollo, struck the killing blow. The death of Patroclus transformed Achilles' anger from wounded pride into something far more dangerous, a berserker fury that made him temporarily more than human. His grief echoed across the battlefield as he called for new armour from his divine mother. Hephaestus himself forged the weapons and shield that would carry Achilles through his final battles, decorating the shield with scenes that encompass the entire scope of human experience: cities at peace and war, farmers and shepherds, dancers and musicians, the whole panorama of life that the hero would soon leave behind. Achilles' return to battle brought slaughter on a scale that appalled even the war-hardened veterans of both armies. Trojans fled before him like deer before a lion, and the river Scamander ran red with blood. When the river god himself rose to protest the pollution of his waters, Achilles fought him as well, demonstrating that his fury now extended beyond mortal enemies to the very forces of nature. Only the intervention of Hephaestus, whose fires dried up the river, ended this supernatural combat. The inevitable confrontation between Achilles and Hector provided the emotional climax of the entire war. Hector knew that he was destined to die in this encounter, but honor and duty to his city required him to face the man who had killed his friend Sarpedon and so many other Trojans. 3 times he ran around the walls of Troy with Achilles in pursuit, the 2 greatest warriors of their generation, locked in a deadly race that would end only with death. When Hector finally turned to fight, deceived by Athena into believing that his brother Deiphobus stood beside him, the duel was brief but decisive. Achilles' spear found the one vulnerable spot in Hector's armor, the throat where the neck met the shoulder. With his dying breath, Hector begged that his body be returned to his family for proper burial, but Achilles, still mad with grief and rage, refused and dragged the corpse behind his chariot around the walls of Troy. For 11 days, Achilles continued this desecration, but the gods preserved Hector's body from corruption, and finally Zeus sent a message through Thetis commanding her son to accept ransom and return the body. The meeting between Achilles and Priam, when the old king came alone to the Greek camp to beg for his son's corpse, provided one of the most powerful scenes in all of ancient literature. The 2 men, each destroyed by loss, found a moment of mutual understanding that transcended the hatred of war. As the gentle night deepens around you, the final phase of the war unfolds with the arrival of new allies for both sides. The Amazon queen Penthesilea came to Troy's aid with her warrior women, seeking glorious death in battle. She nearly achieved her goal when she faced Achilles in single combat. But even as his spear pierced her heart, the hero fell in love with his dying enemy, adding another layer of tragedy to his already unbearable burden. Memnon, king of the Ethiopians and son of the dawn goddess Eos, arrived with a great army to support his ally Priam. His battle with Achilles became a contest not just between 2 heroes, but between their divine mothers, Thetis and Eos, each pleading with Zeus to spare her son. The scales of fate tilted toward Memnon's death, and when Achilles struck the killing blow, Eos's tears became the morning dew that would forever honor her fallen child. Achilles' own death came soon after, struck down by an arrow from Paris's bow, but guided by Apollo to the one vulnerable spot on the hero's body. His heel, where his mother's grip had prevented the waters of the Styx from making him completely invulnerable. The battle over Achilles' corpse became one of the fiercest of the entire war, with Ajax and Odysseus fighting desperately to recover their friend's body, while the Trojans pressed forward to claim this ultimate prize. The funeral of Achilles marked the end of the heroic age of the war, and the beginning of its craftier, more pragmatic final phase. The award of Achilles' divine armor to Odysseus, rather than Ajax, led to the latter's madness and suicide, removing another of the war's greatest champions. The Greeks began to rely more on strategy and less on individual heroism, a shift that would ultimately prove decisive. The capture of Troy required not just military victory, but the fulfillment of several prophecies and the acquisition of certain objects and people essential to the city's fall. The Greeks needed the bow and arrows of Hercules, which had been left with Philoctetes on the island of Lemnos when he was abandoned there due to a festering wound. They required the presence of Neoptolemus, Achilles' young son, who inherited his father's prowess in battle. Most crucially, they needed the Palladium, an ancient statue of Athena that was said to protect Troy as long as it remained within the city. Odysseus and Diomedes accomplished the theft of the Palladium in a daring night raid that took them through the sewers beneath Troy's walls. Their success in this mission demonstrated that the city's divine protection had been withdrawn, paving the way for the final stratagem that would bring about its fall. The famous Trojan horse, constructed under Athena's guidance by the craftsman Perseus, became the instrument of Troy's doom and the symbol of the victory of cunning over strength. The horse itself was a masterpiece of engineering and deception, large enough to hold 30 of the greatest Greek warriors in its hollow belly, yet crafted with such skill that it appeared to be a genuine offering to the gods. The Greeks burned their camp and sailed away, leaving behind only Sinon, a volunteer who allowed himself to be captured and told a convincing story about the horse being a gift to Athena that would bring good fortune to whoever possessed it. Despite the warnings of the priest Laocoon and the prophet Cassandra, the Trojans decided to bring the horse into their city as a trophy of their apparent victory. That night, as Troy celebrated the end of the siege, the hidden warriors emerged from the horse and opened the city gates to admit the Greek army, which had returned under cover of darkness. The sack of Troy began at midnight and continued until dawn, bringing to an end the greatest city of the ancient world and the civilization it represented. The fall of Troy was marked by acts of both heroism and atrocity that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. King Priam was killed at the altar of Zeus in his own palace, cut down by Neoptolemus while seeking divine protection. Hector's infant son Astyanax was thrown from the city walls to prevent him from growing up to avenge his father. Cassandra was dragged from the altar of Athena and assaulted by Ajax the Lesser, a sacrilege that would bring divine punishment upon the entire Greek fleet. Yet even in the midst of destruction, there were acts of mercy and honour that preserved something of the heroic ideal. Aeneas, carrying his aged father Anchises on his shoulders and leading his young son Ascanius by the hand, escaped the burning city with a small band of followers who would eventually found the Roman race. Helen was reunited with Menelaus. Their reunion marked more by exhaustion than joy after 10 years of war and separation. The returns of the Greek heroes, known collectively as the Nostoi, provided the material for countless additional stories that extended the Trojan cycle far beyond the war itself. Few of the victorious Greeks found easy homecomings, as the gods punished their various acts of hubris and sacrilege during the war. Agamemnon was murdered by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus as revenge for the sacrifice of Iphigenia. The lesser Ajax was drowned by Poseidon for his assault on Cassandra. Many others were blown off course by storms and spent years wandering before reaching home. The greatest of these return stories was the Odyssey of Odysseus, whose 10-year journey home to Ithaca became an epic in its own right. His adventures with the Cyclops Polyphemus, the witch Circe, the Sirens, and the sea monsters Scylla and Charybdis tested not just his courage, but his intelligence and adaptability. The story of his homecoming, his reunion with his faithful wife Penelope, and his slaughter of the suitors who had invaded his palace provided a satisfying conclusion to the tales of the Trojan War generation. As you rest in the quiet comfort of deep night, let your mind follow the threads of myth as they weave themselves into the fabric of later Greek culture and thought. The stories of the Trojan War became the foundation for the great epic poems of Homer, the Iliad, and the Odyssey, which shaped Greek education and values for centuries. The tragic dramatists of Athens, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, mined these myths for the raw material of their plays, exploring the psychological and moral dimensions of the ancient stories with unprecedented depth and sophistication. The myth of Oedipus, which developed independently of the Trojan cycle, provided another powerful exploration of fate, free will, and the relationship between knowledge and destruction. Born to King Laius and Queen Jocasta of Thebes, Oedipus was abandoned as an infant when an oracle prophesied that he would kill his father and marry his mother. Raised by the king and queen of Corinth as their own son, Oedipus learned of the prophecy in adulthood and fled from his supposed parents to avoid fulfilling it. At a crossroads where three paths met, Oedipus encountered an older man in a chariot who tried to force him from the road. In the ensuing fight, Oedipus killed the stranger, unknowingly fulfilling the first part of the prophecy by slaying his true father, Laius. Continuing to Thebes, he found the city terrorized by the Sphinx, a monster with a woman's head, a lion's body, and an eagle's wings, who posed riddles to travelers and devoured those who answered incorrectly. The Sphinx's riddle, what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening, was solved by Oedipus with the answer, man, referring to the stages of human life from crawling infancy through upright adulthood to the bent old age that requires a walking stick. The Sphinx's defeat freed Thebes, and the grateful citizens made Oedipus their king and gave him the widowed queen Jocasta as his bride, completing the prophecy without his knowledge. For many years, Oedipus ruled Thebes wisely and had 4 children with Jocasta, 2 sons, Eteocles and Polynices, and 2 daughters, Antigone and Ismene. But when a plague struck the city, the oracle revealed that the murderer of Laius must be found and punished before the god's anger would be appeased. Oedipus's investigation into the old king's death gradually revealed the terrible truth of his own identity and crimes. Jocasta hanged herself in horror, and Oedipus put out his own eyes, feeling that he could not bear to see the world in which such things were possible. The story of Oedipus resonated deeply with Greek audiences because it explored the fundamental question of human responsibility in a universe governed by fate. Oedipus was both innocent and guilty. Innocent because he acted without knowledge of his true identity. Guilty because his actions, regardless of their motivation, had violated the most fundamental taboos of human society. The myth suggested that knowledge could be more dangerous than ignorance, and that the very qualities that made someone a great leader, intelligence, determination, the refusal to accept easy answers, could also lead to destruction. The next generation of the Theban royal family provided material for additional tragedies that explored themes of family loyalty, civil duty, and the conflict between human and divine law. After Oedipus's exile, his sons Eteocles and Polynices agreed to share the throne, alternating year by year. But when Eteocles' year ended, he refused to give up power. Polynices raised an army of allies, including 6 other champions, and attacked Thebes in the war known as the Seven against Thebes. The siege failed, and the 2 brothers killed each other in single combat, leaving their uncle Creon as regent for Eteocles' infant son. Creon decreed that Eteocles should be buried with honor as a defender of the city, but that Polynices' body should be left unburied as a traitor and an enemy. This decree created a moral crisis for Antigone, who believed that the religious duty to bury the dead took precedence over any human law, no matter how legitimate its source. Antigone's defiance of Creon's edict and her subsequent death became one of the most powerful symbols in Greek literature of the individual conscience standing against unjust authority. Her willing martyrdom for principle inspired countless later works of art and literature, and her story continues to resonate with audiences who face similar conflicts between personal morality and social pressure. The myths of Thebes were balanced by the stories of Athens, which celebrated the virtues of democracy, reason, and civilized law. The transformation of the Furies into the Eumenides, the kindly ones, symbolized the evolution from a society based on blood vengeance to one founded on legal justice. When Orestes was pursued by the Furies for killing his mother Clytemnestra to avenge his father Agamemnon, he appealed to Athena for protection. The goddess established the first court of law, with 12 Athenian citizens serving as jurors to hear the case. The trial of Orestes became a symbol of the triumph of civilized justice over primitive vengeance. When the jury was evenly divided, Athena cast the deciding vote for acquittal, arguing that the killing of a mother was indeed a terrible crime, but that it was justified by the even greater crime of Clytemnestra's murder of her husband. The Furies, initially enraged by this verdict, were eventually persuaded by Athena to transform themselves into beneficent deities who would bless Athens with fertility and prosperity. As the night continues its peaceful embrace, the later developments of Greek mythology reflect the changing concerns of Greek society as it evolved from the heroic Bronze Age into the classical period of city-states and philosophical inquiry. The mystery religions, particularly those centered at Eleusis, promised initiates a blessed afterlife through participation in secret rites that reenacted the death and rebirth of Persephone. These mysteries provided hope for personal salvation that complemented the more public aspects of Greek religion. The figure of Dionysus, god of wine, theatre, and ecstatic experience, embodied the tension between civilization and wildness that ran through much of Greek thought. His myths often involved the resistance of established authority figures to his worship, followed by terrible punishments for those who denied his divinity. King Pentheus of Thebes, who refused to acknowledge Dionysus as his cousin and forbade the women of the city to participate in the god's rites, was torn apart by his own mother, Agave, who in her Dionysiac frenzy failed to recognize her son. The story of King Lycurgus of Thrace provided another example of the dangers of opposing Dionysus. When the king imprisoned the god's followers and tried to destroy his vines, Dionysus drove him mad and cursed his land with barrenness. The oracle declared that the land would remain sterile until Lycurgus died, leading his own people to dismember him to restore their country's fertility. These myths served as warnings against the dangers of excessive rigidity and the rejection of the irrational aspects of human nature. The cult of Asclepius, god of healing and medicine, represented the more benevolent aspects of divine intervention in human affairs. Born from the union of Apollo and the mortal woman Coronis, Asclepius was raised by the centaur Chiron and learned the arts of healing that would make him the most revered physician in the ancient world. His sanctuaries, particularly the one at Epidaurus, became centers of medical practice where priests combined religious ritual with practical treatment, creating the foundation for the medical tradition that would be passed down through Hippocrates and his followers. The myth of Asclepius's death illustrated the Greek belief that even the most beneficial gifts could become dangerous if taken to extremes. When Asclepius became so skilled that he could raise the dead, Hades complained to Zeus that the natural order was being disrupted. Zeus struck down the healer with a thunderbolt, but later raised him to divine status in recognition of his beneficent works. This story reflected the Greek understanding that death was a necessary part of the cosmic order, and that even the greatest healers must ultimately submit to fate. As you drift deeper into the realm of peaceful dreams, let your mind wander through the vast landscape of minor myths and local legends that filled out the rich tapestry of Greek storytelling. Every spring and river had its nymph, every mountain its god, every grove its sacred history. The story of Echo and Narcissus explored the nature of unrequited love and self-obsession. Echo, a nymph who had been cursed by Hera to only repeat the words of others, fell in love with the beautiful youth Narcissus. But her inability to speak her own words prevented her from winning his affection. Narcissus, beloved by many but loving none in return, eventually encountered his own reflection in a still pool and fell in love with what he saw Unable to embrace or possess this image, he wasted away from longing, eventually transforming into the flower that bears his name. Echo, heartbroken by his indifference, faded away until only her voice remained, forever repeating the words of others from hidden places in the mountains and valleys. The transformation myths collected by later authors like Ovid reflected the Greek belief in the fundamental interconnectedness of all natural phenomena. Daphne, pursued by Apollo, was transformed into a laurel tree to escape his unwanted advances, and the god made her leaves the symbol of victory and poetic achievement. Io, loved by Zeus, was turned into a cow to hide her from Hera's jealousy, but the goddess was not deceived and sent a gadfly to torment her across the known world. Syrinx, fleeing from Pan's pursuit, was changed into marsh reeds that the god then cut and bound together to create the first panpipes. These stories of transformation served multiple functions in Greek culture. They explained the origins of natural phenomena, provided metaphors for psychological states, and demonstrated the god's power to alter the fundamental nature of reality. They also reflected a worldview in which the boundaries between different forms of life were permeable, and where divine intervention could radically alter the course of any individual's existence. The realm of the dead, ruled by Hades and Persephone, was imagined as a vast underground kingdom divided into different regions based on the moral character of the deceased. The Elysian fields provided a paradise for heroes and the virtuous, where they could enjoy eternal happiness in meadows of asphodel flowers. Tartarus served as a place of punishment for the wicked, where sinners like Tantalus, Sisyphus, and Ixion endured eternal torments specifically designed to match their crimes. Tantalus, who had served his own son Pelops as a meal to test the god's omniscience, was condemned to eternal hunger and thirst, standing in a pool of water beneath fruit trees whose branches would retreat whenever he tried to eat or drink. Sisyphus, who had cheated death twice through his cunning, was forced to push a great boulder up a mountain for eternity, watching it roll back down each time he neared the summit. Ixion, who had attempted to seduce Hera, was bound to a wheel of fire that spun constantly through the underworld. The majority of the dead, however, wandered through the grey meadows of asphodel, neither rewarded nor punished, but existing in a dim twilight state that reflected the Greek ambivalence about the afterlife. This conception would later influence both Roman religion and early Christian thought about the fate of souls after death. The story of Orpheus's second journey to the underworld, in some versions of the myth, provided a different perspective on death and artistic immortality. After losing Eurydice forever, Orpheus wandered the earth singing songs of such beauty and sorrow that even the stones wept to hear them. Eventually, he was torn apart by the Maenads, followers of Dionysus, who were enraged by his exclusive devotion to his lost love. His head and lyre floated down the river Hebrus to the island of Lesbos, where they continued to sing until finally silenced by Apollo, who was jealous of Orpheus's musical ability. The myth of Orpheus resonated throughout the ancient world as a symbol of the artist's relationship to mortality and transcendence. His music could move the very foundations of reality, soften the hearts of gods and monsters, and even briefly overcome death itself. Yet his very humanity, his inability to trust completely in love's power, ultimately limited his achievement. The story suggested that art could approach the divine but never quite reach it, remaining always bounded by the artist's mortal limitations. The Eleusinian mysteries, centered on the myth of Demeter and Persephone, offered initiates a different kind of immortality through spiritual transformation rather than artistic achievement. The secret rites, which were maintained for nearly 2,000 years, promised participants a blessed afterlife and a deeper understanding of the sacred cycles that governed existence. The mysteries attracted initiates from throughout the Mediterranean world, including many of the greatest philosophers and writers of antiquity. What exactly transpired during the Eleusinian initiation remained one of the best-kept secrets of the ancient world. But scholars believe it involved a dramatic reenactment of Persephone's death and resurrection, combined with the revelation of sacred objects, and perhaps the consumption of a psychoactive potion made from ergot-infected grain. The experience was said to be so transformative that initiates emerged with an unshakable conviction that death was not the end of existence, but merely a transition to a different form of life. As the peaceful night deepens around you, the philosophical implications of Greek mythology begin to reveal themselves more clearly. The stories that had entertained and educated countless generations also provided the raw material for sophisticated philosophical inquiry. The pre-Socratic philosophers used mythological concepts as starting points for rational investigation of the natural world. Thales suggested that water was the fundamental element from which all things arose, perhaps influenced by the ancient myths of Oceanus as the source of all rivers and springs. Heraclitus developed his philosophy of eternal flux, partly in response to mythological accounts of cosmic cycles and divine transformations. His famous assertion that you cannot step into the same river twice reflected the Greek mythological understanding that change was the fundamental characteristic of existence, even among the gods. Empedocles' theory of the four elements, earth, air, fire, and water, corresponded roughly to the primordial powers described in the earliest creation myths. The classical philosophers of Athens, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, maintained a complex relationship with the mythological tradition. While they criticized the literal interpretation of myths as unworthy of divine perfection, they recognized their psychological and educational value. Plato's famous allegory of the cave, in which prisoners mistake shadows on a wall for reality itself, draws heavily on the mythological tradition of divine revelation and the journey from ignorance to knowledge. Aristotle's analysis of tragedy in his Poetics was based primarily on the mythological dramas of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. His concepts of catharsis, hamartia, and the unity of action were derived from his observation of how these ancient stories affected their audiences. The idea that tragedy should purge the emotions of pity and terror through the spectacle of heroic suffering was grounded in the psychological effects of mythological narratives. The Stoic philosophers found in mythology a rich source of allegories for their ethical teachings. They interpreted the labors of Hercules as symbols of the wise man's struggle against passion and adversity, and saw in the figure of Odysseus a model of the rational individual navigating the challenges of existence through intelligence and perseverance. The Stoic concept of fate as a rational force governing the universe drew heavily on mythological accounts of prophecy and divine providence. The mystery religions that flourished throughout the Hellenistic period represented a synthesis of Greek mythological themes with influences from Egypt, Persia, and other cultures encountered through Alexander's conquests. The cult of Isis, adapted from Egyptian religion, promised initiates redemption through the goddess's suffering and resurrection. The worship of Mithras, derived from Persian tradition, offered soldiers and merchants a path to salvation through participation in cosmic battles between light and darkness. These syncretic religions maintained the essential structure of Greek mythological thinking, while adapting it to the needs of an increasingly cosmopolitan and individualistic society. They emphasized personal salvation rather than civic duty, promised direct communion with divinity rather than mediation through traditional priesthoods, and offered hope for a blessed afterlife rather than acceptance of mortality as the natural human condition. The influence of Greek mythology on Roman culture began even before the Roman conquest of Greece, transmitted through the Greek colonies in southern Italy and Sicily. Roman poets like Ennius and later Virgil drew extensively on Greek mythological themes, while adapting them to reflect Roman values and historical experience. Virgil's Aeneid transformed the relatively minor figure of Aeneas into the founder of the Roman race, creating a mythological foundation for Roman imperial ideology. The Roman identification of their gods with Greek counterparts, Jupiter with Zeus, Mars with Ares, Venus with Aphrodite, represented more than simple borrowing. It reflected a sophisticated attempt to reconcile indigenous Italian religious traditions with the more developed mythological system of Greece. The result was a hybrid mythology that maintained Greek narrative sophistication, while emphasizing Roman virtues like duty, discipline, and service to the state. As you rest in the gentle embrace of deepening sleep, the transformation of Greek mythology in the hands of Roman authors reveals new dimensions of meaning. Ovid's Metamorphoses collected and retold hundreds of transformation myths, creating a vast epic that traced the history of the world from creation to the deification of Julius Caesar. His treatment of these ancient stories emphasized their psychological rather than religious significance, exploring themes of love, power, and change with a sophistication that influenced literature for centuries to come. The historical works of Livy and Tacitus drew extensively on mythological parallels to illuminate contemporary events and characters. The story of Coriolanus, the Roman general who turned against his native city, was shaped by the mythological tradition of heroes whose virtues became their downfall. The account of Nero's persecution of Christians borrowed imagery from myths of divine punishment and the conflict between order and chaos. The rise of Christianity presented both a challenge and an opportunity for the mythological tradition. Early Christian writers like Clement of Alexandria and Origen argued that Greek myths contained partial truths that prepared the way for Christian revelation, while critics like Tertullian rejected them as demonic deceptions. The synthesis attempted by writers like Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite created a Christian mythology that incorporated elements of Platonic philosophy and Greek mystical tradition. The allegorical interpretation of mythology flourished throughout the medieval period as Christian scholars sought to preserve classical learning while subordinating it to Christian doctrine. The Roman poet Boethius, writing in prison while awaiting execution, drew on mythological examples to illustrate the philosophical consolations available to those facing adversity. His Consolation of Philosophy became one of the most influential works of the medieval period, transmitting Greek mythological wisdom to Christian Europe. The Islamic world also preserved and transformed Greek mythological tradition through translations and commentaries that emphasized its philosophical rather than religious content. Scholars like Al-Kindi and Averroes found in mythology valuable insights into human psychology and natural philosophy that complemented rather than contradicted monotheistic faith. Their works would later influence the revival of classical learning in medieval Europe. The Renaissance witnessed a renewed interest in mythology as both artistic inspiration and philosophical wisdom. Humanist scholars like Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola saw in ancient myths profound truths about human nature and cosmic order that had been obscured by medieval misinterpretation. Artists like Botticelli and Michelangelo found in mythological subjects opportunities to explore human beauty and divine transcendence with a freedom that religious themes could not provide. The development of printing technology allowed mythological texts to circulate more widely than ever before, while new translations made Greek and Roman sources accessible to vernacular readers throughout Europe. Handbooks of mythology like Natalis Combs's Mythologiae provided artists and writers with standardized versions of ancient stories, contributing to the development of a shared European cultural vocabulary based on classical precedents. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries created new tensions between mythological and empirical approaches to understanding the natural world. While figures like Johannes Kepler continued to find in mythology valuable insights into cosmic harmony and mathematical relationships, others like Francis Bacon argued that mythological thinking represented a primitive stage of human development that must be transcended through systematic observation and experimentation. Yet even as literal belief in mythology declined among educated Europeans, its psychological and artistic value continued to be recognized. Writers like Shakespeare drew extensively on mythological themes and characters, while philosophers like Giambattista Vico argued that mythology represented a distinct form of human wisdom that could not be reduced to either scientific fact or logical proposition. The Romantic movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries witnessed a profound revival of interest in mythology as a source of spiritual and artistic inspiration. Poets like Keats and Shelley found in ancient myths powerful symbols for exploring the relationship between human consciousness and natural forces, while German scholars like the brothers Grimm and Friedrich Schelling developed new theories about the relationship between mythology and national character. The development of comparative mythology in the 19th century, pioneered by scholars like Max Müller and Friedrich Max Müller, attempted to trace common patterns underlying the mythological traditions of different cultures. While their specific theories were often naive by modern standards, their work contributed to a growing understanding of mythology as a universal human phenomenon that revealed important truths about the structure of human consciousness and social organization. Carl Jung's development of analytical psychology in the 20th century provided new tools for understanding the psychological significance of mythological narratives. His concept of the collective unconscious suggested that mythological patterns represented archetypal structures that were hardwired into human consciousness, explaining their persistent appeal across different cultures and historical periods. Jungian analysis of Greek myths revealed recurring patterns of individuation, transformation, and the integration of opposing psychological forces. The influence of Greek mythology on modern literature, art, and popular culture demonstrates its continued relevance to contemporary concerns. Writers like James Joyce and T.S. Eliot used mythological parallels to provide structure and meaning to modernist explorations of fragmented consciousness and social alienation. Psychologists like Joseph Campbell argued that mythological narratives provided universal patterns for understanding the human journey from dependence through crisis to mature integration. As the night reaches its deepest point and your consciousness drifts toward the realm of dreams, the final significance of Greek mythology begins to emerge. These ancient stories, born from the specific historical and geographical circumstances of Bronze Age and classical Greece, have transcended their original context to become a permanent part of human cultural inheritance. They continue to provide insight into the fundamental questions that have always confronted human consciousness: the relationship between individual desire and social obligation, the meaning of suffering and death, the possibility of heroic achievement in an apparently meaningless universe. The gods and heroes of ancient Greece speak to contemporary audiences not because their specific adventures remain credible, but because the psychological and moral conflicts they embody remain eternally relevant. Achilles' choice between a long, obscure life and a short, glorious one continues to resonate with anyone who must balance personal fulfillment against lasting achievement. Antigone's defiance of unjust authority provides inspiration for those who must choose between legal compliance and moral conviction. Odysseus' long journey home speaks to everyone who has experienced the gap between aspiration and achievement, the distance between the self we imagine and the self we become. The enduring power of these myths lies not in their literal truth, but in their psychological accuracy. They map the landscape of human emotion and motivation with a precision that has rarely been equaled in later literature. The Greek insight that character is destiny, that our fundamental nature shapes our fate more than external circumstances, remains as relevant today as it was 3,000 years ago. The mythological understanding of the relationship between human consciousness and natural forces also speaks to contemporary concerns about environmental destruction and technological hubris. The Greek recognition that human beings are both part of nature and separate from it, both capable of transcending natural limitations and subject to natural laws, provides a framework for thinking about humanity's proper relationship to the physical world. Perhaps most importantly, Greek mythology preserves a vision of human dignity that refuses to be diminished by an acknowledgement of human limitations. The heroes of Greek myth are not perfect beings, but flawed individuals who achieve greatness through their response to adversity. They demonstrate that meaning can be created through action, even in a universe that may ultimately be indifferent to human concerns. Their stories suggest that while we cannot control our fate, we can control our response to it, and that this response is what defines our essential humanity. The final saga of Greek mythology is thus not any particular story, but the ongoing process by which these ancient narratives continue to illuminate human experience. Each generation discovers new meanings in the old tales, new relevance in the ancient conflicts, new wisdom in the timeless patterns of loss and recovery, separation and reunion, death and transformation. As long as human beings continue to love and struggle, to hope and despair, to seek meaning in an often meaningless world, the gods and heroes of ancient Greece will continue to speak to the deepest levels of human consciousness. In the gentle darkness of this peaceful night, as your breathing grows slower and your mind drifts toward the realm of dreams, let yourself be carried by the eternal rhythms of these mythological narratives. Like Odysseus sailing across wine-dark seas toward his distant home, like Psyche journeying through trials toward reunion with love, like Persephone moving between the worlds of light and shadow, you too are part of an endless story that connects individual experience to universal patterns of meaning and transformation. The myths of ancient Greece remind us that we are all heroes of our own stories, all participants in a cosmic drama that is larger than any individual life, yet finds its meaning only through the choices and actions of particular individuals facing specific challenges in particular moments of time. Rest now in the knowledge that these stories will continue their eternal work of illumination and consolation, speaking to future generations as they have spoken to all the generations that have come before, weaving together the threads of human experience into patterns of lasting beauty and significance that transcend the boundaries of time and mortality. The gods may sleep, but their dreams continue to shape the world, and in those dreams, the eternal questions find their eternal answers, again and again, in the turning of the seasons, the rising and setting of the sun, the endless dance of love and loss that gives meaning to mortal existence.